Good afternoon and welcome everyone to this webinar hosted by the Institute of Global Politics here at SIPA, the School of International and Public Affairs. IGP is a new institute at SIPA devoted to driving real-world impact by convening leading scholars and practitioners, developing policy solutions, and training the next generation of leaders. I am Keren Yarhi-Milo, the Dean of SIPA and the Adlai E. Stevenson Professor of International Relations. As part of the Institute of Global Politics' commitment to civil discourse, and given the ongoing nature of this war, this will be the first of several conversations on this topic. Today's discussion is about Israel's choices in the weeks ahead. In the upcoming weeks, we will be devoting attention to other aspects of the war in Gaza, including the humanitarian impact in Gaza and Israel, the humanitarian consequences of international law violations, and the implications for the larger Arab-Israeli conflict. And we are pleased to be joined by Colombia's President, Minouche Shafik, who would like to say a few words. Minouche.
Thank you, Keren. Welcome to everyone here. The conflict in the Middle East has been a source of global geopolitical tension and with severe consequences for people living in the region for many, many decades. The issues are complex, controversial, and many people have very strongly held. What is the role of a university at a time of heightened political tensions like today? My view is that as an institution, it's important that universities avoid taking a political position. You cannot provide a platform for debate while being a participant in the debate. University leadership must provide care for its community and foster an inclusive environment. As I said during my inauguration recently, the university is the home and sponsor of critics. It is not itself the critic. A university must sustain an extraordinary environment of freedom of inquiry and maintain an independence from political fashions, passions, and pressures. At Columbia, we take great pride in our ability to apply our knowledge and expertise to the challenges facing our world. And as Keren said, one of the objectives of the Institute for Global Politics was to provide a forum for different views to be debated while modeling academic integrity and respect for many perspectives. Today's event is an example of that, and there will be more. Thank you very much to the panelists, Hillary Rodham Clinton, Stephen Biddle, Nadav Ayal, Kim Khattas, and Robert O'Brien for your participation in this panel. We're very grateful that you're sharing your expertise with all of us at this critical moment, and I'll turn it back to Keren.
Thank you, President Shafik. This past Saturday, Hamas launched a surprise terrorist attack on Israel, targeting Israeli citizens, leaving close to 1,000 dead and having taken an estimated 150 hostages. In response, Israel has fought to regain control of the towns taken by Hamas and has launched airstrikes against Hamas targets in Gaza, already resulting in hundreds of Palestinian casualties. Israel also announced it will be mobilizing for a ground operation and a total blockade around Gaza, cutting off water, electricity, and food supplies. The devastating assault by Hamas was unprecedented in its complexity. It was unprecedented in the scope of the intelligence and operational failure. And it was unprecedented in the sheer ability of Hamas to capture over 20 Israeli towns, something not seen since 1984, and in the taking of civilian hostages back to Gaza. Equally shocking is that it all occurred on the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, which until Saturday was Israel's biggest intelligence failure. As a scholar of international security and someone who served in Israel's intelligence services, I find the fact that this kind of coordinated attack could happen inexplicable, given the level of planning involved. The fact that hundreds of Hamas terrorists were able to enter Israel and move freely for hours deep into the country commit the heinous killing and return to Gaza with so many hostages is just incomprehensible in light of the massive investment in Israel's security system and intelligence apparatus. Postmortems will certainly be written about this, and it will remain to be seen whether the current leadership will survive this colossal failure. In 1974, 1 year after the Yom Kippur War failure, Golda Meir was forced to resign. In 1983, Menachem Begin resigned in light of the failure of Israel in the First Lebanon War. The attack also comes on the heels of tumultuous year of mass protest and political division within Israel as a result of a controversial judicial overhaul led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. There were concerns, indeed alarms, about how this division might affect Israeli national security and the military preparedness, while creating the perception of weakness among Israel's adversaries. The attack also comes amid a new power realignment in the Middle East, whereby the United States was close to brokering a peace agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel. The future of that Arab-Israeli peace agreement may not be dead, but it will likely be postponed. We also know, based on initial reports, that Iran may have played a role in this attack, which opens up the possibility of this war spreading beyond Israel to include other Iran proxies, such as Hezbollah and other militias in Syria. And the ongoing frustration with the status quo amongst Palestinians is also a huge factor that policymakers must address. The question for this panel is what happens now? What are the next moves that Israel will make? This is a situation that is highly fluid and dynamic and will be ongoing for some time, unfortunately. There will be many casualties and fatalities on both sides over the coming weeks, and the situation is only going to get increasingly complicated. We are pleased to be joined today by 5 wonderful panelists to discuss the current situation on the ground. Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton is a professor of international and public affairs here at SIPA, the 67th Secretary of State and a former senator from New York. She is the faculty advisory board of the Institute of Global Politics. Stephen Biddle is a professor of international and public affairs at SIPA, a member of the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies here at SIPA, and an IGP affiliated faculty member. Nadav Eyal is the author of the book Revolt, the Worldwide Uprising Against Globalization. He's a senior columnist for Yediot Achronot Daily, which is Israel's most circulated newspaper. Kim Gaddis is the author of Black Wave, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the 40-year rivalry that unraveled culture, religion, and collective memory in the Middle East. She is also a contributor writer for The Atlantic magazine and an IGP inaugural Carnegie Distinguished Fellow. Robert O'Brien is co-founder and chairman of American Global Strategies. He was the 27th U.S. National Security Advisor and is also an IGP inaugural Carnegie Distinguished Fellows. We're very pleased to have them for a conversation today. Throughout this conversation, please feel free to share, to submit your questions in the chat. Please keep them short and in the form of a question. And now I would like to turn to the panelists. Nadav, I would like to start with you. You are on the ground in Israel. In fact, you are in the shelter right now. Of all the unprecedented events of the past 72 hours, what stands out to you, Nadav, as the most meaningful and consequential development? Nadav, you are muted.
Thank you, Keren, for this, and I'm very glad to join you at SIPA. I just watched President Biden speak about what's happening in Israel, and I think he really understood the the very specific nature of the anomaly that we are watching today. This is not about a military surprise in the sense of 1973, although this comparison in terms of intelligence failure is of course true. What we're seeing now is the single most widest massacre done against Jews since World War II, and it was done on the course of 36 hours. Just to give us some sort of an idea, Israel is a small country. It's a 10 million country today. The number of people who were massacred during these events is more than the number of Israeli soldiers that were killed in the 6 Days War, in which Israel managed to occupy and take land, which was 150% of its land of the 1948 borders. This is more people who died there than in the Second Lebanon War that lasted a long time, or the First Lebanon War that lasted more than 6 months. So for this kind of small nation, and I'm talking as someone who knows friends, sons of friends, daughters, families, people who I know, my editor in the newspaper, people who have lost their loved ones, people who have been killed themselves, or people that have seen, witnessed, or know that their loved ones have been abducted, kidnapped to the Gaza Strip by the Hamas terrorists. So what we are seeing is a national trauma that equals more a sort of a 9/11 fivefold, sevenfold, comparatively speaking, in terms of Israel's population, than a military event as of itself. And also, and that's very important to state right now, it's about Israel's security to defend itself by itself. And what President Biden did today, and the White House has been doing in the last couple of days, is to give Israel the idea that it has the back of the United States of America, and that's very important, but also try again and again to deter against the possibility of a second front. I've spent this day and the day before that in the north, after we have witnessed what happened in the south, and we covered that too. And the reason I went up north and slept there during the night in areas that right now are almost completely vacant of Israeli citizens is because of the sense of war. Israel has mobilized in 2 days more than 350,000 reserve soldiers. This is a huge amount for any country, significantly for such a small country. This country is entirely enlisted right now. Businesses are closed up north, and frankly speaking, many businesses are closed even here in the center, not far from Tel Aviv. And what we are seeing there is people preparing for war. And that's a major question for Israel right now. Is this thing, considering the intelligence breakdown on this issue, is this thing part of some sort of an Iranian elaborate plan, or a Hezbollah Hamas elaborate plan to draw Israel into a regional war of sorts? And we definitely have signals that Hezbollah is playing or ploying with this possibility. We have seen that by them bombing an outpost of the Israeli intelligence in Har Dov a couple of days ago. Right after this attack, we have seen this again by them allowing an Islamic Jihad terrorist group to reach the border and cross the border into Israel, where two Israeli soldier and a senior officer were killed, and that unit of terrorists was eliminated. And we have seen this again today by them launching rockets into the northern Galilee. If indeed, the idea here is for them to sort of engulf Israel into a regional affair, this might have global consequences.
Yes.
And I think the White House understands that.
Yes, and we will get to talk about those potential regional and global consequences. Kim Gaddis, you're joining us from Beirut. Thank you for being with us. Now, we know that Israel is preparing for a sustained ground attack and is currently deploying what is known in the region as the Dahya strategy. That is comprehensive airstrikes of the neighborhoods where the leadership resides and operates. And this will undoubtedly result in a significant number of Palestinian casualties. We're seeing it already, including most likely civilian fatalities. Can you speak to the experience of the people in Gaza right now and what they should expect over the coming weeks as the ground operation and airstrike intensify? And what, in your opinion, is the role of Egypt, Qatar, and the international community to help the people in Gaza?
Keren, thanks for having me. And it's good to join from Beirut, just north of Israel. And as Nadav was saying, there is tension on the border and real concern in Lebanon that we too might be dragged into this war because of the presence of Hezbollah here and also the presence of groups like Islamic Jihad and Hamas in Lebanon, who have been since the start of this year coordinating more. And Iran and Hezbollah have brought Hamas and the Islamic Jihad closer to them. And they've been speaking about this unification of fronts. And I have to say that when I heard that over the course of the year, it wasn't clear to me what this meant, but now we know what this means.
Yes.
We know that it means that Iran's involvement and support for Hamas has increased and allowed them to carry out this horrendous attack against Israel. The images are just barbaric. What we don't know, as Nadav pointed out, is what the ultimate goal is. Is this it, as horrifying as it already is? Or is there indeed going to be a widening of the conflict? Is Hezbollah simply trying to harass the Israeli army in northern Israel, or is it trying to provoke a wider reaction? My assessment for now is that Hezbollah has too much to lose from dragging what is essentially Iran's forward base, in a way, Lebanon, into this conflict. You refer to the Dahya strategy, which I lived through and covered as a BBC reporter in 2006. I actually live very close to Dahya, and I've been wondering what to do should we get to the point where Lebanon gets dragged into this. The suffering of civilians in these conflicts is just, horrific and unspeakable. It also is difficult to explain unless you've experienced it. I can't exactly say what Nadav is going through. I have a sense, but I haven't lived his experience. And when you're living in, I've never been to the Gaza Strip, but I can assume that it's, very dense, 2 million people living in very close quarters, half of them children, and the suffering is going to be immense. And what I wrote in the Financial Times today is a look back at 1982, when Ariel Sharon, the then defense minister, wanted to eliminate the PLO from Lebanon and laid siege to the city of Beirut. And he succeeded in one of the goals, but it was actually strategically really counterproductive, because what it did is bring Iran into the conflict. That's when Iran's involvement first started, with the arrival of Iranian Revolutionary Guards to Lebanon 2 days after the Israelis invaded Lebanon. So the potential for regional tension, conflagration is there. The global ramifications are there as well, because what I didn't know was that in 1982, 1983, the Russians were rubbing their hands seeing America fail and Israel getting a beating in Lebanon. And they made sure that all of America's plans in Lebanon would fail. They had a relationship with Iran at the time and with Syria. And today, we're watching this axis from Moscow to Tehran, to Hezbollah and Hamas. So this is, as Nadav was saying, this has potential for something global. And I think that this is also the time to double down on peace. I know it's very difficult after the horror that we've seen to ask Israelis to even consider any concessions to Palestinians, but I've heard some of those voices, I've seen them, because these cycles of violence where people are trying to wipe each other out, it's leading us to further cycles of violence. The normalization talks with Saudi Arabia are probably on hold or taking place very discreetly still, but I'm sure that the Saudis are trying to think through how they can take the upper hand again in the region and show that they, not Iran, have something tangible to offer to the Palestinians going forward. So the Qataris, the Egyptians, the Saudis must stay in close contact with the United States to try to find a way out of this in a way that is really more sustainable and long-term for everyone, because we're all very tired of having to go through these wars.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kim. I would like now to turn to Secretary Clinton. Hillary, some have referred to the October 7 attack as Israel's 9/11. You were the senator from New York during 9/11 and worked with the administration in its aftermath. You've also dealt quite a lot with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. As a leader, how do you expect him to handle the current crisis?
Well, Karen, when I first heard the analogy used that it was Israel's 9/11, it really shocked me because obviously that was such a traumatic moment for the United States. But the more that I have seen unfolding in Israel, the death toll, which proportionately, if you were to compare to our population, would be, nearly 25,000 people, many thousands more injured. The surprise attack that we didn't expect in 2001, that the Israelis did not expect, a few days ago, has certainly led me to understand why so many Israelis and others are referring to it as Israel's 9/11. The impact of that trauma on our country 22 years ago had very long-lasting and real-world consequences. I don't like to indulge in, what coulda, shoulda, woulda happened if we had done some things differently. But I think it's important, especially for people who are looking at the situation right now, to ask themselves, are there any lessons that could be learned from a comparable event in terms of both what the Israeli people themselves need to get through this trauma? As Nadav said, this requires the kind of unity and resolve that, must come from leadership at all levels in Israel, so that people who I've personally had a dear friend who, whose niece, her husband and baby were murdered, and her two older children hid in a closet for 13 hours until they were rescued. We will see so many terrible stories of individual devastation, along with the collective experience that Israel is going through. So starting with the people of Israel and their leadership now, plus the rest of us who believe strongly in supporting Israel's right to not only defend itself, but to, recover as best as it can from this kind of trauma, how can we be as, supportive as possible and necessary? And I appreciated Nadav's reference to President Biden's speech today, because I think it shows that having a, firm but calm president at this really terrible moment is essential for us to, be as helpful as we can. And I thought that the joint statement that President Biden and the leaders of France, Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom issued hit exactly the right tone, making it clear that the terrorist actions of Hamas have absolutely no justification, no legitimacy, must be universally condemned. There is never any justification for terrorism. But at the same time, while we are strongly supporting Israel and its efforts to defend itself, as the statement said, all of us recognize the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people, which cannot be achieved through the kind of actions taken by Hamas. So I think that the leaders of the world, starting with our own president, have struck a very strong and measured tone, but making it absolutely clear we stand with Israel. I think Kim's perspective is essential for us to understand. And, if I were back in the Situation Room, or Robert O'Brien were in the Situation Room in a different administration, but all of us trying to figure out what to do, I think we would be connecting a lot of dots, and a lot of those dots between Hamas and Hezbollah, between other terrorist organizations, between Iran, and yes, let's be very clear, Russia, are ones that have to be followed literally minute by minute. I don't know what the final plans might be by either Hamas, which is in the midst of the fighting, or those who are contemplating how best to support them. But let's just be clear. This is very much in Iran's interests. This is a kind of event that Iran can use to make itself the defender of values, and make it clear there's a difference between those Arab countries that, quote, normalized relations with Israel, and clearly putting the discussions with the Saudis on hold, if not on ice. I think that everyone wants to avoid any kind of expansion of this war, certainly whether it comes from Hezbollah from the north, or I have also seen reports of Hamas calling for uprising in the territories of the West Bank. We have to be extremely careful. And we have to make sure that our consultations with our Israeli counterparts are taking all of that into consideration. I could make the argument that it's in Iran's interest to try to expand the conflict, especially through their client, Hezbollah. But I could also make the interest that it would be a very bad strategic decision for them to do so. We don't know how this is going to play out. But we know from what Kim said, and following this for so many years, Iran has been involved in Lebanon since 1982. They have created Hezbollah, basically. They have funded it. They have trained it. They have armed it. They have used it as their ground soldier militia in their support for Bashir Assad. They have coordinated with the Russians, who have provided air support and air attacks that have been, incredibly devastating for the Syrian people over many years. So we are dealing with terrorist groups and terrorist nations. And I don't think anybody should have any illusions about either. And it is our absolute necessity to do everything we can to support Israel in their battle against the terrorist groups. Hopefully it's limited to Hamas, but then we have to understand, and I will throw this in, Russia has become a terrorist state. It provided support to Assad. It is conducting a barbaric invasion in Ukraine. And I think there is no doubt, especially after Putin's statement of yesterday, that if they are not actively involved and supporting and signing off on drones going to Hamas instead of drones going to their forces in Ukraine from Iran, they are certainly looking at the upheaval that this is causing and the distraction that may well assist them in Ukraine. So I would argue this is already, in many ways, a global challenge. And our first and primary duty and obligation right now is to support Israel and to do everything we can with Israel to prevent the conflict from expanding.
Thank you, Hillary. On the issue of Hamas for a second before we move to the wider region. So this is obviously not the first time for you. I'm sorry, this is not the first time that Israel and Hamas have been in hostilities. And for you, in 2012, you negotiated a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. And what insights did that experience give you that you might wish to share about how Hamas operates, how its leadership sees the world? What insights can you share?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It was November of 2012. Hamas was launching rockets. That's always their calling card into Israel. And Netanyahu was he was prime minister then as well, and he was very seriously considering, along with his war cabinet, whether or not to mobilize to try to go into Gaza. And clearly neither I nor President Obama wanted to see Israel engaged in a land war again with Hamas in Gaza. So I did fly to Israel, had a very long set of meetings with Netanyahu and those in his cabinet. I then went to the West Bank, met with Abbas, and told him that we were going to be looking to see if we could get a ceasefire. He had no real role to play, but at the same time, we didn't want there to be any kind of spillover effects in the West Bank. And then going back to Jerusalem, reporting what I'd found, hammering out the details of a potential ceasefire, I flew to Cairo. And there's a big difference because, Mohammed Morsi had just been elected president of Egypt, a Muslim Brotherhood president. And so we knew that there were linkages between the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. And we believed that we could leverage those linkages to enlist Egypt in putting pressure on Hamas. And Egypt had some national security reasons of their own, because they were beginning to see terrorist groups working in the Sinai, and they were worried about that from their own national security perspective. And it was to Morsi's credit that he did work with us to persuade Hamas to enter into a ceasefire and to help hammer out the terms of that ceasefire. The situation has gone so far beyond that now. And, when I look at the financial support that Hamas has received over the years since 2012, when I look at the increasing role that Iran has played in Gaza with Hamas, it's imperative that we look at every diplomatic approach that we can imagine, and who might have any kind of influence, maybe Qatar, maybe the Turks. But Iran has become the primary sponsor of Hamas now. And so we got to get a more collective response to try to balance that and to try to put pressure on Hamas in ways that it will recognize and respond to. It's possible through great diplomatic effort, but, the situation was so different that, as I recall, literally a handful of Israelis had been injured and killed. It wasn't at all what we've seen with this horrific massacre. And we also, I think, have to recognize that we have to rebuild a coalition of countries who will stand with Israel against terrorism, and also look for ways, and this goes back to a point Kim made, to look for ways that we can send a message, if possible, to the Palestinian people that, the Hamas leadership is only causing them more pain and suffering. And because we know Hamas uses civilians as shields, they often, put leadership, command and control hubs into schools, hospitals, mosques, all kinds of places where civilians are hostages, and Palestinian civilians are hostages to Hamas. We have to try to figure out how best to first defeat them. That has to be the first piece of business, and that obviously is up to the Israelis, but then look for ways to try to divide them. And that's going to require Israel, whoever is their government, being more willing to look for ways that they have given up on. And I've been to Gaza, I have seen the urban environment. I have been in some of the small buildings, that make up what is the landscape of Gaza, and 2 million people jammed in there, basically at the will of Hamas, is going to cause enormous loss, and we've got to figure out how to respond to that as well.
Thank you, Hillary. Rob, I want to turn to you, because one of the issues where one of the differences between previous rounds of hostilities and the war between Israel and Gaza is the presence now of estimated 150 civilian hostages, including women and children. You've successfully negotiated several hostage rescues in your time as a special presidential envoy for hostage affairs. How does the presence of hostages complicate decision-making during times of war?
Well, it certainly complicates the lives of the planners in the IDF and America, for that matter. We have American hostages that are being held. I'm hearing now from families that have hostages who've been taken to the Gaza, or believe it to have been taken to the Gaza Strip. And the first option here, given the brutality of the invasion and the sheer savagery that we saw with the massacres of children, of babies, of elderly, of Holocaust survivors. I mean, this is not collateral damage that took place because a military base was attacked. These were wanton attacks, acts of terrorism to try and destroy the morale and will of the people of Israel. I don't think it's going to succeed. In fact, I think it's going to cause just the opposite. I want to just take a moment on behalf of myself, my family. I've spent much time in Israel, as I know many people on this call have. It's a wonderful place. We love Israel. Our hearts are with the Israeli people. And what happened was just utterly horrific and just barbarism. It wasn't war. And part of that was taking these hostages. Many of these hostages were women and children that have been dragged back. They're in the tunnels. They're probably in cages. We've seen reports of some of them having potentially been executed. Certainly, we've seen young children being abused, and we're going to have to figure out how to send a message to Hamas and defeat them. First of all, on Israeli soil, and I think the IDF has made good progress there. But they're going to have to be defeated in Gaza. I mean, these guys crossed every red line, and it was barbaric even for the Iranians to go after the women and children, the elderly, the way that it happened. That government cannot be allowed to stand in Gaza, and Israel has no choice but to go into Gaza and to take the Hamas out lock, stock, and barrel. I mean, they have to be eliminated as a governing force. Now, whether that means a boss comes in with a PA and governs there, or there's some new governing arrangement, but Hamas cannot be allowed to govern in Gaza. And that's going to take a lot of force and it's going to cost a lot of Israeli lives to make that happen. But this attack showed that we can't go back to the old days of negotiating like we did and Secretary Clinton did and others have over the years, with a barrage of rockets and some kind of accord where more work permits are issued and things go back to the status quo ante. That's not going to happen this time. So in the midst of rooting out Hamas, we're going to have to try and save the lives of as many hostages as we can. I called on the first night of the attacks for the United States to make its hostage rescue elements of our special forces and our FBI hostage rescue team available to the Israelis to rescue Israeli citizens. Now we know that there are Americans involved. So this isn't just Hamas versus Israel. This is Hamas and Iran versus the United States. And I'm not suggesting we get American troops, and I think the Israeli Defense Force can do just fine on its own, but they can't use our exquisite assistance and capabilities on the hostage rescue front. So we're going to have to take out Hamas, and the Israeli leaders are going to have to take out the Hamas government and regime At the same time, rescue hostages, and that's a very complicated, operation to run. And it's not without a lot of risks, Israeli soldiers and servicemen and women. I just want to step back for a moment, though, and touch on something that Secretary Clinton talked about. We're in a new era of great power competition. We've got America and our allies, our partners, and Israel is certainly one of them and has been since 1948. We're in an era where we've got Russia, which is an extraordinarily bad actor, and is engaged in a brutal campaign in Ukraine where war crimes have been committed. Maybe not caught on film the way that they were in this attack, but was similar in nature. We've got a regional hegemon in Iran that is engaged took all the winnings it made from the JCPOA and invested them in the Houthis and in Kataib Hezbollah and Hamas and the Assad regime, and engaged in brutality for years now. And we've got China, which is threatening now. Xi Jinping is threatening, even as we speak today, to take over Taiwan and do the same thing to Taiwan that Russia's done to Ukraine. So of those powers, we've seen Russia invade Ukraine. We've seen Iran basically through its cat's paw, Hamas and potentially Hezbollah invade Israel. And we've got to see what's going to happen as Xi Jinping calculates, is this an opportune time? Because America's attention is focused on Ukraine. It's not going to be focused heavily on Israel, our partner, and we've got hostages there. Is this a time that Xi Jinping is going to use to exploit our attention on these areas? So we've got to be very, very careful, and we need to support Ukraine, continue to support Israel, but we're also going to have to make sure that the Chinese communists understand that we're there for our partners in Taiwan, so that we don't have a third humanitarian disaster on the island of Formosa. So it's a complicated situation. Certainly, Hamas has to be crushed. Iran has to be warned of the consequences. And the first thing I would do with the hostages in this case, and I hope it's being done quietly through the Swiss or through the Qataris, some of the partners that we have that maintain diplomatic relations with Iran, is Iran needs to understand that they're going to be held personally liable, the Iranian leaders, for the well-being of our hostages, of those men and women and babies and teenagers that they drug back in, some who were horribly wounded and dragged back in. One young American man, we were told, apparently was dragged back in with half his arm blown off. And they better be attentive to them and not kill them, because we're going to hold the leaders of Hamas and the leaders of Iran responsible. And that message needs to go to them. That's something that the Iranians do respond to when they know that their leadership is on the line. And then as far as Hezbollah goes, I wouldn't be surprised if Hezbollah seeks to take advantage, but I think they have to understand they should read their history as well. In the Yom Kippur War, Israel moved all of its armor down south. They defeated the Egyptians, held on, by their fingernails up north, and then turned that whole, used their internal lines of communication and the fact that it's a compact country and not far from north to south, and immediately turned around and went up and defeated the Syrians. And look, I'm confident in the IDF. It'd be great. It'd be a great sacrifice, but I'm confident in the IDF with American support and backing and munitions, just like President Nixon sent, everything that Israel needed 50 years ago in Yom Kippur. We do the same thing now. And if Israel has to first defeat Hamas and then turn its attention to the north and defeat Hezbollah, and utterly defeat them and root them out and root out all the rockets and root out all the terrorists, sadly, at great cost to civilians in Lebanon and civilians in Gaza, and that's a terrible thing. But Israel is going to defend itself, and if it has to defeat Hamas and Hezbollah, I think it will, especially with the U.S. backing. And the last point I'll make is that the U.S. needs to stand by Israel. This isn't a 3-day operation. This isn't a two-week operation. We've been standing by Ukraine for 1.5 years, and I've been with Ukraine from the start, even though some folks in my party haven't been. And I've advocated for President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people. We've got to do the same thing for Israel. We've spent 1.5 years back in Ukraine. We've got to back Israel, not just now, but two weeks from now, when public opinion turns and the anti-Semites and the people that hate Israel around the world start turning on Israel. We have to be there, because this isn't going to be over quickly.
Yeah, no, it is definitely going to be a sustained campaign. Very quickly, Rob, you served as President Trump's national security advisor during the initial negotiations on the Abraham Accords. And what do you recall was the assessment of Hamas' likely reaction to this Arab-Israeli rapprochement? And was it assumed that Hamas would also in the context of, potential peace with Saudi Arabia, knowing how Iran and how Hamas what were the assessment at the time, or from your recollection?
Well, unfortunately, and I think this was I can't remember the event. It wasn't Henry, but it was one of Hillary's predecessors who coined the term that the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And they, especially when it comes to peace, and they had a great opportunity at the outset of the Abraham Accords to get a really good deal, which they turned down. And so we went to the other countries. We didn't think there was with UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, we didn't think there'd be a huge outcry. But one of the things we did is we kept the negotiations very quiet, very secret, and we announced them, just about the same time that they were signed. And so there wasn't a lot of time to gin up opposition. I think one of the things that the Palestinians and certainly Hamas and Iran have been looking at, and make no mistake, Iran wants to keep in. And by the way, I've been very complimentary of the Biden administration for Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken's work on the expanding the Abraham Accords to include Saudi. We tried to, we ran out of time and we couldn't get them on board, but Iran doesn't want that to happen at all. And so, it's not surprising that Iran ginned up Hamas to engage in this, to sideline those talks and derail those talks. It's interesting. It hasn't come from the West Bank. It hasn't been a Palestinian intifada, so to speak, but this is a direct attack from Iran. And certainly, you're right, Karen. It was to derail the impressive diplomatic work that's been being done to bring Saudi Arabia into the Accords.
Thank you, Rob. Steve Biddle, I want to go to you. You studied the Second Lebanon War, and we've already heard about the one of the questions are on right now is whether Hezbollah is going to join the war on a second front. And we don't know what was agreed between Hezbollah, Hamas, and the leaders of Iran in that meeting that took place allegedly in Beirut, in terms of if they're going to get involved and at what point of the war. So how would a full-scale intervention by Hezbollah, or perhaps even by the Palestinian Authority on the West Bank, at some point change the conflict's military dynamics?
Yeah, an intervention by Hezbollah or by the PI or both would substantially increase the scale of opposition forces that Israel's got to deal with. So the fundamental problem here is that non-land force military options are very unlikely to be successfully coercive in persuading Hamas to give up the hostages. So coercive campaigns of this kind are slow, they're subject to counter-coercion, the imagery of suffering inside Gaza will mount. So almost certainly Israel is going to engage in some sort of land invasion of Gaza, and it's probably not going to be a shallow invasion of the kind they did in 2014. The only benefit of that is blowing up tunnels that cross the border. The border was not crossed by tunnels over the weekend. It was crossed by breaches of the border fence. The land invasion that Israel is probably about to mount is going to be deeper, more sweeping, and oriented towards essentially a reoccupation of Gaza. That's an extremely labor-intensive project. That requires a large troop count. The point to be served by that is complicated, even if you just limit it to Gaza, right? So you can invade the country, you can tear up infrastructure, you can destroy Hamas military assets, you can kill or capture Hamas leaders, but then what? I mean, what have you accomplished at the end of the day by doing this? If you do that and then leave and treat it as essentially a punitive expedition, if you're lucky, you might deter another attack of this kind in the future, but maybe not. I mean, obviously, the capability to do this has always been resident in Israel and didn't deter the attack over the weekend. It's not clear that this would be any more effective moving forward. If instead you occupy all of Gaza and the intent is depose Hamas, root it up, root and branch, destroy or capture all the rockets, what are you going to replace it with? Right? The Palestinian Authority? I mean, how could you possibly make them less legitimate in the eyes of Gazans than having them ride in on the backs of Israeli tanks to take over the government of Gaza? So you've got a massive labor-intensive military land campaign in Gaza whose end game is very unclear. Now, if Hezbollah enters the war from the north, or if the PA enters the war from the West Bank, multiply that by a factor of 10, right? I mean, which is only partly a problem of Hezbollah adding fighters and Hezbollah adding rockets, right? The Hamas and other militants in Gaza are usually assessed to have something in the neighborhood of about 10,000 rockets. Hezbollah is assessed by the Israeli government as having 150,000. Yeah. So the Hezbollah is better equipped and better trained by several orders of magnitude, especially on the training score relative to Hamas's fighters. So you end up with a much larger military threat. More problematically, you end up with a massive increase in the real estate that you've got to occupy, that you've got to pacify, and that you've got to come up with some plausible military strategy that would lead to a political regime that would be more stable, that isn't just the Gaza Strip. Now it's Lebanon south of the Litani. Now it's the Gaza Strip plus Lebanon south of the Litani plus the West Bank. I mean, how much? I mean, how much real estate can Israel plausibly expect to occupy and control in this way?
Right. And so Nadav, just quickly to you, from what you're hearing in Israel, from an Israeli perspective, what are the war aims? I mean, there is obviously huge pressure to do something that has never been done. But what are realistically the war aims, and what's the public opinion on what should happen next is?
Well, I should be totally clear about this. Israel and no Israeli government can allow Hamas to remain with its military force in the Gaza Strip any longer. So whether or not this takes a year, 2 years, or 3 years, whether or not this is going to include a ground maneuver of the sense that Steven just talked about, or anything else, this is simply nothing that, as Rob said, Israel cannot allow this to itself, because the entire project of the state of Israel means that it can be a safe haven for Jews. So this is a sort of a national trauma that cannot allow this. Now, as far as public opinion goes, the Israeli public, reservists are at their units at 150%. They have managed to bring a national unity government, which will probably be formed either tonight or tomorrow morning, together with Netanyahu, something that seemed implausible. And any way you look at it, we are into a campaign. Now, some voices within the security apparatus are saying, don't get into a ground invasion to Gaza right now, because this is what Iran and Hezbollah wants you to do. Because Hamas wouldn't have done that unless it would have known that it has some sort of backing. And these are some very smart people in the Israeli defense apparatus saying tactically, don't do that. Whether or not their opinion will be accepted, I don't know. But the final aim is going to be not rooting out Hamas as a populist section of the Palestinian society, but rooting out every military ability of Hamas.
And Kim, from your perspective, what is your assessment about the design, the plan from Iran? Is Hezbollah going to get involved, do you think, at some point? And is this part of the grand planning that happened allegedly? Again, we don't know about the Wall Street Journal reporting. What do you make of it? And what do you estimate the next moves are?
I thought the Wall Street Journal reporting was a little bit too perfect in the description of how these meetings were taking place. So I have some doubts about the exact way that this unfolded. I find it hard to believe that these kinds of meetings would have gone undetected. So if you put the two things together, there's something amiss with the picture. But as we've heard from Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken, Iran is certainly on some level complicit. And as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, there has been this call for a unification of fronts. And just over the summer, there were some clashes in the Palestinian camps here in Lebanon, in southern Lebanon, where it was understood that actually Hamas and the Islamic Jihad were trying to take control of the camps. And, we're dealing with so many problems in Lebanon. We just looked at it as an inconvenience, or more clashes, more violence. But now it becomes clear that there was I'm just gonna turn this phones off. There was a greater plan to you still hear me?
We can hear you. Yes.
Yeah, that there was a greater plan to come together and carry out some kind of operation. I had a sense of foreboding over the summer, but it was hard to predict, of course, exactly the nature of what was being planned. What Iran is hoping for right now, surely they have a plan. I don't know exactly what the contours of that are, but that's why I think Israel, the US, and allies in the region need to think very strategically and not get drawn into what Iran's plan might be. As Secretary Clinton was mentioning earlier, after 9/11, there was an emotional reaction, and there was a military reaction, and there was a political reaction. And looking back to it, the outcome of that was not exactly successful. 20 years of, war in Iraq, in Afghanistan, the results of that are not exactly a net positive. And I always worry when I hear, we want to eliminate, we want to root out, because if it was that easy, I think Israel would have done it. But we've had several Lebanon wars, and Hezbollah is still there. So I think we need to think differently, and we need to think more big picture about what is happening here. I understand the emotional reactions, but it hasn't worked in the past. And as Stephen said, this could become a multi-front war. Right. So we need strategy, and we need big picture, and we need close coordination with all the allies, because the devastation that is going to be wrought on Gaza is really going to be painful to look at as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Secretary Clinton, Hillary, to you, well, we know in 1973, the US provided a lot of assistance to Israel during the Yom Kippur War, and we know that assistance is already flowing to Israel. But unlike 1973, you have a U.S. Congress currently has no Speaker of the House, and we have no ambassador to Israel. We hope, and we think this will happen, that our own Jack Lew, faculty member here at SIPA, will get confirmed. But how does this near paralysis on Capitol Hill, does it complicate Washington's ability to resupply Israel? And is there anything else that you think the United States can or should be doing at this moment?
Well, it's not ideal. That's clear. We should have a functioning government. We should have an ambassador in Israel. I think that will be remedied, or at least I hope it will be within the next 2 weeks. I hope that, the Republican caucus can elect a speaker maybe this week, but, certainly, one of this is not, as big an issue as many of the others facing us, but, there's something called the Gang of Eight, who are the people who lead both the House and the Senate, who get briefed on these kinds of very sensitive issues. And, there's a debate. Do you include, Congressman McHenry, who is kind of an acting caretaker, or not? I mean, nobody should have to think about this. We should have a functioning government. But putting that to one side, there are so many ways that President Biden can, and I'm sure already is, rushing reinforcements of supplies to Israel. We have certainly done everything we could in the past whenever Israel faced any kind of threat. And obviously 50 years after the Yom Kippur War, we know what was negotiated then to provide everything that we could to help Israel defend itself. That will be happening. There will at some point, probably sooner than later, have to be congressional legislation passed to make sure we restock whatever Israel needs, including Iron Dome capacity. And also Ukraine, and you know that's going to be a heavy lift in the Congress, but it's a necessary lift, especially as you connect all these dots, to understand what's really going on here with two major crises, two wars by two of our adversaries at work in two different regions of the world at the same time, and let's hope that we don't get a third one. So I just want to say that this shows you cannot predict what is going to happen, which is why we need a functioning government operation, no matter who is in charge, who's in the White House, who is running the Senate as the majority, who is in the majority in the House. Great countries don't play these kinds of games. And sadly, we need to pull ourselves together to be in the best possible position, both to support Israel, but also to understand this really complicated chessboard about what is happening, who is doing what to whom, what might be over the horizon, so that we are prepared to act as soon as we possibly can. So I think we will get an ambassador confirmed soon. I think we will certainly do everything we can short of legislation to provide whatever Israel needs, but we need to get ourselves organized to do everything that's required.
Thank you. And we have we have over 100 questions from the audience. We only have time, I think, for 2, and this is open to everybody, so just jump in. One is Israel is saying that whatever happened, and we heard it from Nadav, cannot be what will happen, that there needs to be a break. Israel cannot allow for Hamas to be in power. But what is the end game, except for trying to eliminate the leadership, replacing it with what? Does the Palestinian Authority make a comeback in Gaza? Might the Netanyahu government make a serious attempt in separating the Gazans from Hamas? Anyone wants to speculate as to how this really realistically ends? I know it's a tough one.
Nadav, could we hear from you on that?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, basically, as far as the Israelis are concerned, they're talking about the possibility of handing over responsibility back to the PA and the international community after a long campaign in the Gaza Strip. Whether or not this is going to be possible or plausible, I don't know, but that's the kind of conversation they're having. I will also look at the example Kim mentioned, the examples from Lebanon. I would look at 1982 and the first Lebanon war that ended with basically the PLO leaving, Yasser Arafat leaving Beirut on ships on his way to Tunis, where he spent the next 11 years until the Oslo Accords. So, and that's an example. Is it possible within the Gaza Strip? I don't know. Is it the aim, the specific aim of the Israeli government, the Israeli cabinet, war cabinet? We don't know yet, but we do know that they're very resolved, and this is a consensus in Israel, that they cannot have the ability to do this again, the military ability. And for that, they need to be in the Gaza Strip, at least, substantially.
Thank you, Nadav. Sorry, go ahead, Kim, please.
Yeah, I just want to interject about 1982, because Nadav is right that the PLO left and they went to Tunis, but instead of the PLO, we got Hezbollah. So I'm always worried about what the next iteration looks like, and how over the course of the last 40 years, extremes have won over. Arguably, including within the Israeli political body with the government of Bibi Netanyahu, which is the most extreme government in Israel's history, which will now be able to rally people around the flag. But the 1982 comparison worries me because of that.
Yeah, I agree.
Karen, Nadav makes a point that may contribute to the end of the hostage crisis, though, and that depends on if the Hamas leaders value their lives and their families' lives sufficiently. One way to resolve the issue would be to give them safe passage to Qatar, to Turkey, to Iran, in return for release of the hostages. And then so there is something akin to what happened with the PLO leaving. But what we saw, the brutality we've seen from Hamas is really more akin to ISIS than anything that we've seen from the PLO or even Iran in the past. So we don't know if they want to be martyrs or not, or if they're going to all wear S vests and go down the way Baghdadi did, or with their families, or if they want to save themselves and their families and maybe cut a deal for the hostages and leave Gaza. We'll have to see, but there is a potential that's one possible outcome to get the hostages out without further harm.
It's interesting. And the last question, I think this is, Steve, might be something you want to comment on. As I said, this is going to be probably a sustained and devastating war with fatalities on both sides, in the Palestinian in Gaza and in Israel, including many civilians. How and to what extent can you, if anything, can be done to limit civilian casualties and suffering in the weeks to come? And you are muted, Steve, sorry.
There are things that can be done, but they're limited in their effect. Right. So you can restrict fire to identified targets only. You can use small caliber weapons rather than artillery and large caliber missiles. You can fire only when you're fired upon. You can distribute warning to civilians that a strike is coming by text message or leaflets. The IDF has developed a policy of dropping non-explosive ordnance on the roofs of buildings to tell the occupants that building's about to be struck. You can do variations on all these techniques. The problem is, if you're going to do a large-scale invasion and occupation of a densely occupied urban area, and the defenders decide to fight back, it's impossible to do this without large-scale loss of civilian life and large-scale destruction of civilian property and infrastructure. It can't be done. There is no precision weapon in the world that can kill a fighter in the midst of a collection of non-combatants and not wound any of the non-combatants, and do this on the kind of industrial scale you would need to do it to reoccupy Gaza, much less if this war expands. And rational, irregular combatant defenders, knowing this historically, exploit these things for military advantage by deliberately making the distinction between combatant and non-combatant as ambiguous as possible, so as to goad governments into killing more civilians than necessary, so as to generate more resistance to what the government is trying to do, either locally or globally. I mean, it's better to kill fewer, and it's better to destroy less, and it's better to impose less suffering than more. And we can all hope that the IDF operates in a way that produces less suffering rather than more. But the scale of suffering we're looking at in the event of any plausible land invasion of Gaza is going to be stratospheric, and it's going to involve a lot of suffering on the part of Israelis and the IDF. The casualty levels you can expect in this kind of urban warfare in an extremely densely populated area that is aggressively defended is nasty for the military as well as the civilians.
Right.
It's just awful all around.
It is awful all around. And as we have to unfortunately finish this webinar and this conversation, I want to thank the panelists for being with us. This was all put together in a very short period of time, and I'm very pleased and that you all agreed to participate. Thank you so much. We will have more events. This is a beginning. This is a first in several conversations that we will be holding here from SIPA, and I hope that you will join us. And until then, thank you very much, and we will see you. Bye-bye.